The rain lashed against the penthouse windows, each droplet a tiny, insistent drumbeat against the polished glass. It mirrored the frantic rhythm of my own heart, a chaotic symphony of fear and a desperate, gnawing hope. Below, the city lights blurred into streaks of neon and amber, a vibrant, indifferent tapestry that felt a million miles away from the suffocating reality of this opulent cage. I traced the condensation on the glass, my fingertip leaving a fleeting, ghostly trail. The expensive silk of my robe, a gift from him, felt like a shroud. It was the color of midnight, the same color as the secrets that had been swirling around me for the past year, pulling me under. His name was Julian Thorne. He was a titan of industry, a man whose name was whispered with a mixture of awe and envy in boardrooms and society pages alike. And I, Clara Hayes, a freelance graphic designer who'd stumbled into his orbit at a gallery opening, was apparently his mistress. That's what I told myself anyway. That's what the hushed conversations, the furtive glances, the carefully orchestrated encounters implied. He'd swept into my life like a whirlwind, all sharp suits, piercing blue eyes, and a smile that promised both danger and salvation. He'd admired my work, he'd said, seen a spark in me that was rare. He'd taken me to places I'd only dreamed of, exclusive restaurants where the waiters knew his name before he even spoke, private jets that whisked us away to sun-drenched islands, glittering parties where I felt like an imposter in borrowed finery. Each encounter was intoxicating, a heady cocktail of luxury and illicit thrill. But there were always boundaries. He never spoke of his past, his family, his true life. He was a phantom, a beautiful enigma who occupied my nights and haunted my days. He paid for everything, of course, my rent on a modest apartment, which he'd insisted on upgrading to this penthouse, for my comfort, my designer clothes, the expensive art supplies I'd barely touched. It was all part of the arrangement, I'd rationalized. The unspoken terms of our liaison. I was the discreet, beautiful companion, the one who wouldn't ask too many questions, the one who understood the demands of his high-profile life. The guilt had been a constant companion at first, a dull ache beneath the surface of my exhilaration. I told myself it was wrong, that I was betraying. Well, I wasn't sure who. There was no one in my life to betray. My parents were gone, my closest friend lived across the country, and my dating history before Julian was a series of lukewarm encounters that had left me yearning for something more. He had filled that void, albeit in a way that was increasingly unsettling. Lately, the unsettling had morphed into a quiet dread. The furtive glances from his staff, the way his personal assistant, a severe woman named Ms. Albright, always seemed to be watching me with a knowing, almost pitying expression. The sudden, unexplained disappearances for days at a time, followed by lavish apologies and extravagant gifts. Tonight, the dread was a suffocating presence in the air. Julian was supposed to be back from a business trip to Tokyo. He'd promised he would be. He'd promised we'd have dinner, that he'd tell me all about it. But the penthouse was silent, save for the relentless drumming of the rain. I'd been pacing for hours, my bare feet silent on the plush carpets. I'd checked my phone 100 times, the screen mockingly blank. No calls, no texts. It wasn't like him. Julian Thorne was a man of his word, at least when it came to his promises to me. Or so I thought. The silence amplified my anxieties. What if he was with someone else? Not another mistress, that was too obvious, too vulgar for Julian. But what if his real life, the one he kept so carefully hidden, was demanding his full attention? What if I was just a distraction, a pleasant interlude that was now over? I walked into the master bedroom, a space that felt both luxurious and strangely impersonal. The king-sized bed, draped in crisp white linens, was a monument to his absence. On the bedside table, A sleek silver picture frame caught my eye. I never looked at it, never dared to. It was always turned away from me. But tonight, a morbid curiosity, a desperate need to understand the man who held my affections captive, propelled me forward. With trembling fingers, I reached for the frame. It was surprisingly heavy. I turned it over. The woman in the photograph was stunning. Her hair was a cascade of dark waves, her eyes the same piercing blue as Julian's, but softer, warmer. She was smiling, a genuine, radiant smile, and she was wearing a simple, elegant wedding band on her left hand. Beside her, Julian looked younger, his smile less guarded, but undeniably the same man. And around them, a small group of people, all dressed in formal attire, raising glasses in a toast. It looked like a wedding reception. My breath hitched. A wedding reception? A wedding band? My mind reeled, struggling to process the image. This wasn't a girlfriend. This wasn't a casual fling. This was a wife. A cold dread, far more potent than anything I'd felt before, washed over me. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth, stifling a gasp. The photograph slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the polished floor. The glass didn't shatter, but the sound echoed in the vast silence of the penthouse, a jarring punctuation mark to my unraveling reality. This was not the life I thought I was living. This was not the role I thought I was playing. I wasn't the mistress. I was... What then? A pawn? A secret? A fool? The rain outside intensified, a furious downpour now, as if the heavens themselves were weeping for my shattered illusions. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my body heavy with a despair so profound it felt physical. The silken robe felt less like a gift and more like a costume, a flimsy disguise for the charade I'd been participating in. My mind raced, desperately trying to reconcile the Julian I thought I knew with the man in the photograph. The clandestine meetings, the secrecy, the carefully curated intimacy. It all took on a new, horrifying meaning. He hadn't kept his mistress a secret. He'd kept his wife a secret. And I, Clara Hayes, was the other woman. The one in the shadows. The one who thought she was loved, but was merely indulged. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I looked around the opulent penthouse, the expensive furnishings, the breathtaking view. It was all a beautiful lie, a gilded cage built around a truth I had been too blind, too eager, too desperate to see. My hands, still trembling, fumbled for my phone. This time, I didn't look for a text from Julian. I scrolled through my contacts, my fingers heavy with a newfound resolve. I needed answers. And I knew exactly who to ask, Ms. Albright, the severe, watchful assistant. If anyone knew the truth, it was her. The clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness. Each second was a hammer blow against my already fractured composure. The rain continued its relentless assault, a fitting soundtrack to the storm raging within me. I was no longer just an innocent caught in a complicated affair. I was a woman who had been deliberately deceived, her heart and her trust systematically manipulated. And the thought of confronting Julian, of demanding an explanation for this elaborate deception, filled me with a terrifying mix of rage and a desperate, aching need for the truth, no matter how devastating it might be. The night was young, and my world had just imploded. The rain lashed against the penthouse windows, each droplet a tiny, insistent drumbeat against the glass, a frantic symphony that mirrored the chaotic rhythm of my own heart. It was a storm outside, and a tempest raged within. The photograph, stark and damning, lay on the polished mahogany desk like a shard of broken glass, its sharp edges slicing through the carefully constructed illusion of my life. Julian Thorne, the man I believed I was secretly loving, the man who had promised me. What had he promised me? Fleeting moments of passion, whispered intimacies, a life draped in opulence, all shrouded in the delicious thrill of the illicit. Now, all I saw was the cold, hard truth. A ring glinting on the finger of a woman who was clearly not me. A wedding band. It mirrored the frantic rhythm of my own heart, a chaotic symphony of fear and a desperate, gnawing hope that this was some elaborate mistake. But the woman in the photograph, she was radiant, her smile serene, her gaze locked onto Julian with an easy possessiveness that spoke of years, not months, of shared history. It was a gaze I had craved, a gaze I had convinced myself I was slowly, subtly earning. Instead, I had been a fool, a willing participant in a charade I hadn't even known I was playing. I traced the edge of the photograph with a trembling finger. My own reflection, pale and drawn, stared back from the glossy surface, a ghost haunting the edges of Julian's manufactured reality. I had rationalized everything. His late nights, his sudden departures, the way his staff sometimes looked at me with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. I'd attributed it to the complexities of his high-powered life, to the inherent difficulties of a clandestine affair with a man of his stature. I'd told myself that my independence, my career as a freelance graphic designer was my strength, my shield against the vulnerability that such a relationship demanded. But now, my strength felt like a cruel joke, my independence a flimsy veil over a profound and devastating loneliness. The expensive champagne, a vintage Julian had insisted I enjoy while he was away, sat untouched on the bar. Its effervescence seemed to mock my disquiet, the tiny bubbles rising like fleeting moments of happiness that would inevitably burst. The penthouse, once an intoxicating symbol of his devotion, of the opulent world he had drawn me into, now felt like a gilded cage. The plush velvet sofa, the abstract art adorning the walls, the breathtaking panorama of the city lights blurring into streaks of neon and amber. It all felt like a set designed to distract me, to keep me pacified, while the real world, Julian's real world, spun on without me. My mind reeled, desperately trying to reconcile the Julian I knew, the charming, attentive, intensely private man who filled my nights with a passion I'd never known, with the man in this photograph, the man who was clearly someone else's husband. Had he lied about everything? The late-night calls, the stolen afternoons, the quiet intensity in his eyes when he looked at me? Was it all just a performance? A game played with a disposable pawn? Guilt had been a constant companion, a low hum beneath the surface of my stolen happiness. The guilt of knowing I was involved with a married man, even if I hadn't known the full extent of his marital status. I had justified it, telling myself that he was unhappy, that he needed an escape, that our connection was something rare and profound, transcending the mundane rules of society. But this photograph, this wasn't the justification of an unhappy marriage. This was the stark, undeniable proof of a deliberate, calculated deception. My fingers clenched around the photograph. A cold fury began to simmer beneath the shock, a visceral reaction to the violation. He hadn't just betrayed his wife, he had betrayed me. He had used my own insecurities, my own longing for connection, to weave a narrative that suited his clandestine needs. He had made me believe I was special, that our connection was unique, when in reality, I was just another secret, another facet of his carefully curated life. The rain intensified, drumming a relentless rhythm against the glass, a soundtrack to my unraveling. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the city lights outside a distant, indifferent spectacle. The opulence of the penthouse, once a source of wonder, now felt suffocating. The silence punctuated only by the storm and the frantic thudding of my own heart. I needed answers. Not from Julian, not yet. He was a master of evasion, of carefully chosen words that danced on the precipice of truth. I needed someone who knew, someone who saw. Ms. Albright, Julian's personal assistant, a woman of formidable composure and an almost unnerving efficiency. She was the gatekeeper to his world, the quiet observer of his comings and goings, the silent witness to his secrets. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, had often held a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher. Was it disdain, or perhaps a hint of sympathy? I had dismissed it then as the professional distance of someone employed by a man of Julian's power. But now, I saw it differently. Perhaps she knew. Perhaps she had seen me, had seen the charade, and had remained silent out of obligation. Or perhaps even a twisted sense of loyalty to her employer. The thought of confronting her was terrifying. Ms. Albright was not a confidant. She was an executive, a professional, a woman who operated in the sterile, efficient world of corporate power. She wasn't the type to engage in whispered confessions or tearful admissions. But she was the only one who could possibly hold the threads of this tangled lie together. She was the one who managed his calendar, who booked his flights, who undoubtedly knew the truth about his supposed business trips. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone. The screen glowed, illuminating my pale face. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over her name. Julian Thorne, Clara Hayes, and then Ms. Albright. A name that now represented a terrifying nexus of truth and deception. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I took a deep, shaky breath, the air thick with the scent of expensive leather and Julian's lingering cologne. The storm outside seemed to surge, the wind howling like a mournful spirit. I had to know. I had to understand the depth of this betrayal. My carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of stolen moments and whispered promises, had just imploded. And in the ruins, a new, terrifying resolve began to form. I would not be a footnote in Julian Thorne's clandestine life. I would not be the woman who waited in the shadows. I would confront the architect of this deception, and I would demand the truth, no matter how devastating it might be. My finger pressed down on Ms. Albright's name. The phone began to ring, each tone a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the silence of the penthouse. I imagined her answering, her voice cool and precise, asking what I wanted. What did I want? I wanted to know who the woman in the photograph was. I wanted to know who Julian Thorne truly was. And most importantly, I wanted to know why he had made me believe I was his mistress, when the reality, I suspected, was far more complex and far more devastating. The call connected. Ms. Albright speaking, a crisp, professional voice answered, exactly as I had anticipated. My breath hitched. My voice, when it finally emerged, was a raw, unsteady whisper. Ms. Albright, it's Clara Hayes. There was a fractional pause, just long enough to feel like an eternity. Then her voice, devoid of any discernible emotion, replied, Ms. Hayes, how may I assist you? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Assist me? She could assist me by telling me the truth, by unraveling the lie that had ensnared me. I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat. The photograph felt like a burning weight in my pocket. I need to see you, I managed, my voice gaining a sliver of strength, fueled by the rising tide of my anger. It's about Julian. I found something I don't understand. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost picture her, her expression unreadable, her mind already cataloging the potential implications of my call. Was she surprised? Concerned? Or merely calculating her next move? "Now, Miss Hayes?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes," I insisted, my resolve hardening. "Now, it's urgent." A sigh, barely audible, escaped her lips. "Very well, the usual place. 10 minutes." The line went dead. The click of the receiver echoed in the sudden silence, a punctuation mark at the end of my plea. 10 minutes. 10 minutes until I stepped out of Julian's opulent cage and into the cold, hard reality he had so meticulously concealed. 10 minutes until I faced the woman who held the keys to his secrets. The rain continued its relentless assault, but for the first time since finding the photograph, a sliver of grim determination pierced through my fear. I was no longer a passive recipient of Julian's deception. I was actively seeking the truth. And I wouldn't stop until I found it. The rain lashed against the penthouse windows, an insistent, percussive assault that mirrored the frantic rhythm of my own heart. Each droplet was a tiny, insistent drumbeat against the glass, a chaotic symphony of fear and a desperate, gnawing hope. I traced the condensation on the cool pane, my breath fogging the surface, momentarily obscuring the glittering, indifferent tapestry of the city lights below. They blurred into streaks of neon and amber, a vibrant, faraway world that felt impossibly distant from the suffocating reality of this opulent cage. Julian Thorne. The name itself had once been a whisper of intoxicating possibility, a promise of a life beyond my wildest imaginings. Now, it tasted like ash on my tongue. He'd swept into my life like a whirlwind, a force of nature cloaked in tailored silk and expensive cologne, showering me with gifts and attention that felt both dazzling and dangerously possessive. I'd been a willing captive, seduced by the sheer force of his charisma, the thrilling clandestine nature of our stolen moments. I told myself it was enough, that this fleeting, intense connection was all I needed. I'd rationalized his secrecy, his carefully constructed distance, his refusal to integrate me into his world. I was, after all, his mistress. That was the unspoken, assumed role, the comfortable, albeit illicit understanding we operated under. Or so I had believed. The photograph, clutched in my trembling hand, was a cruel, stark refutation of my carefully constructed reality. Julian, his jaw set in that familiar, confident line. His eyes, those eyes that could melt me with a single glance, fixed somewhere beyond the lens. And on his left hand, glinting with an impossible, damning luminescence, a wedding band. Not a prop, not a temporary adornment, a symbol. A profound, undeniable declaration of a commitment I was not privy to, a life I was not a part of. It was a betrayal so deep, so visceral, that it had ripped through the fragile edifice of my self-deception like a hurricane. My carefully curated persona, the one that allowed me to accept his late-night calls, his weekend getaways, his carefully orchestrated absences, had crumbled to dust. I wasn't the woman he desired in the shadows. I was simply a shadow myself, existing in the periphery of a life that was undeniably, irrevocably claimed. The gnawing doubt that had been a low hum beneath the surface of our relationship now roared like a tempest. Every hushed conversation, every evasive answer, every hurried goodbye replayed in my mind with agonizing clarity, recontextualized by the damning evidence in my hand. Guilt had been a constant companion, a quiet whisper of shame whenever I saw a happy couple, whenever my friends inquired about my life. But this was different. This was a betrayal that cut to the bone, a humiliation that left me feeling hollowed out, exposed. My gaze drifted to the framed photograph on the polished mahogany desk. It was Julian, of course, looking impossibly handsome, his arm casually draped around my shoulders. I was smiling. A bright, genuine smile I hadn't realized I possessed until he'd coaxed it out of me. The image now felt like a grotesque mockery, a staged scene from a play where I was the unwitting, deluded lead. He had built this world around me, a gilded cage of exquisite gifts and fleeting affections, all while maintaining a secret life, a whole other existence I was blissfully ignorant of. And I, Clara Hayes, freelance graphic designer with a penchant for romantic notions, had been so eager to believe the fantasy, I'd blinded myself to the truth. But I was not a fool. Not entirely. The initial shock had given way to a simmering rage, a cold, hard clarity that was far more potent than any emotion I'd felt before. I wouldn't be a ghost in his life, a secret whispered about in hushed tones. I deserved answers. I deserved to know the depth of his deception, the extent of his lies. And if anyone in this sprawling, indifferent city held the key to Julian Thorne's carefully guarded secrets, it was the woman who navigated his world with such steely precision, the woman who saw him at his most vulnerable, his most powerful, his most real. Ms. Albright. Her name itself conjured an image of clipped efficiency and unyielding professionalism. Julian's personal assistant, the gatekeeper, the silent observer. I'd encountered her only a handful of times, fleeting introductions in the marble-clad lobby of Thorne Enterprises, or a brief nod as she orchestrated Julian's departures and arrivals. Her presence was a constant, a quiet reminder of the vast, complex machinery that powered Julian's empire, a machinery I was never truly a part of. She was sharp, her eyes missing nothing, her demeanor a carefully constructed wall of polite deference that hinted at an unshakable authority. I'd always felt a flicker of apprehension in her presence, a sense of being scrutinized, judged. Now, that apprehension felt like a prescient warning. I smoothed down the silk of the dress Julian had bought me, a garment I now saw as a symbol of his ownership, not his affection. The fabric felt alien against my skin, a reminder of the life I was living under false pretenses. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady despite the tremor that still ran through me. I needed this meeting. I needed to confront her, to peel back the layers of Julian's carefully constructed facade, to understand what I was to him, truly. The photograph was proof of his deceit, but Ms. Albright was the witness. A quick, almost frantic search of Julian's personal files, a task I would never have dared before this shattering revelation, yielded her private contact information. It felt like a violation, a descent into a darkness I hadn't known existed, but the need for truth propelled me forward. I composed a terse, urgent message, choosing my words with the same care I would use to craft a crucial business proposal. Ms. Albright, I require an urgent meeting with you at your earliest convenience. It is imperative that we speak privately regarding Mr. Thorne. Please advise on your availability. Clara Hayes. The act of sending it felt both terrifying and empowering. It was a declaration of intent, a refusal to remain a passive victim. I hit send, the small electronic chime echoing in the vast silence of the penthouse, a tiny ripple in the opulent stillness. I leaned back against the cool marble of the counter, the city lights painting shifting patterns on the floor. The rain continued its relentless assault, a soundtrack to my unraveling. I closed my eyes, picturing Ms. Albright's impassive face, her sharp, intelligent gaze. Would she dismiss me? Would she deny me? Or would she perhaps see in my shattered composure a reflection of a truth she already knew? The thought sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me, but beneath it, a flicker of something else began to ignite. Resolve? I was no longer content with being his mistress. I needed to know who I truly was in Julian Thorne's impossibly complicated life. and Ms. Albright was my only hope for an answer. The reply came within minutes, a stark, unsentimental text message. The Atrium Cafe, 2:00 p.m. tomorrow. I will be at a corner table. Do not be late. The Atrium Cafe. A neutral ground, I supposed, a public space designed for discreet meetings, far from the suffocating grandeur of Julian's private world. The simplicity of the message was almost more unnerving than a flood of empathetic words would have been. It suggested a businesslike approach to my personal crisis, a detached acknowledgement of a problem that needed to be addressed. I stared at the words on my screen, the stark black letters a promise of an encounter that would undoubtedly be the most pivotal of my life. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, the photograph of Julian a constant damning presence in my mind. I moved through the penthouse like a ghost, the luxurious furnishings now feeling cold and alien. Every object, every piece of art, every meticulously placed cushion was a testament to Julian's wealth and his taste, a taste that had somehow encompassed me, yet excluded me from the fundamental truth of his existence. I replayed our conversations, dissecting his every word, searching for clues I had so conveniently overlooked. His insistence on privacy, his vague mentions of a demanding career, his reluctance to introduce me to his associates. I had painted myself as the understanding girlfriend, the woman who didn't pry, the one who was content with the scraps of his attention. The reality was far more humiliating. I was the secret. I was the affair. I was the woman who was kept in the dark, meticulously shielded from the truth of his married life. The self-recrimination was a bitter pill to swallow. How could I have been so blind? So eager to believe the fantasy? Was it the allure of his wealth? The intoxicating power he exuded? Or simply a desperate longing for connection that had blinded me? The truth, I suspected, was a tangled knot of all three. I had allowed myself to be swept away, to be consumed by the sheer force of his personality, and in doing so, I had willingly surrendered my critical faculties. As evening bled into night, the city lights outside seemed to shimmer with a newfound intensity, 1,000 tiny stars in a vast, uncaring universe. I found myself drawn to the terrace again, the cool night air a welcome balm against my fevered skin. The rain had finally subsided, leaving behind a glistening, rain-washed world. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. It was in this quiet, reflective moment that a new, disturbing thought began to crystallize. What if Ms. Albright didn't just know about Julian's life? What if she knew about my place in it? Not just as a mistress, but as something else. The wedding band in the photograph was undeniable. But what if the narrative wasn't quite as simple as a clandestine affair? What if there was a legal entanglement, a complexity that went beyond mere infidelity? The thought was unsettling, a shadowy precursor to a revelation I couldn't yet comprehend. But it lodged itself in the back of my mind. A persistent, unwelcome guest. I knew I had to be strategic. Miss Albright was not someone to be trifled with. She was a professional, a woman who dealt in facts and figures, not emotional outbursts. My approach had to be measured, calm, and direct. I couldn't afford to appear hysterical or overly emotional. I had to present myself as a reasonable woman seeking a legitimate explanation for a deeply disturbing discrepancy. The photograph was my anchor, my irrefutable proof of Julian's deception. But the nature of that deception remained a terrifying unknown. The next morning dawned with a pale, watery sunlight. The city, scrubbed clean by the night's rain, seemed to hold its breath. I dressed with meticulous care, choosing a simple, elegant navy suit that conveyed professionalism without being ostentatious. I avoided Julian's clothes, the ones he had bought me, opting instead for something that felt more authentically mine. A subtle touch of lipstick, understated jewelry, and a structured handbag completed the ensemble. I looked in the mirror, searching for the woman who had been so blissfully unaware just days ago. She was gone. In her place was someone harder, more determined, her eyes etched with a weariness that belied her years. As I stepped out of the penthouse and into the hushed efficiency of the elevator, I felt a profound sense of detachment. This opulent space, once a symbol of my stolen happiness, now felt like a gilded prison. I was leaving it behind, at least for now, in pursuit of a truth that promised to be far more devastating than the comfort of ignorance. The ride down was silent, the polished chrome reflecting my solitary figure. I was Clara Hayes, and I was walking into a confrontation that would define the rest of my life. The Atrium Cafe awaited, and with it, the unveiling of Julian Thorne's carefully constructed world, and my place within it. Whether that place was as a scorned mistress or something far more complex, I was about to find out. The gnawing anticipation was almost unbearable, a physical ache in my chest. But I was ready, or as ready as I could ever be. The rain lashed against the penthouse windows, each droplet a tiny, insistent drumbeat against the pane, mirroring the frantic rhythm of my own heart. It was late. The city lights below blurred into streaks of neon and amber, a vibrant, indifferent tapestry against the bruised velvet of the night. Julian was supposed to be back hours ago. His usual cryptic excuses, a last-minute merger, a crisis at one of his overseas subsidiaries, felt thin, worn threads in the increasingly frayed fabric of our arrangement. The photograph, tucked away on his bedside table, had been the seismic shift, the tremor that threatened to bring down the opulent edifice of my life. Julian, his arm slung possessively around a woman with an elegant, unfamiliar face, a faint smile playing on her lips, and then the glint of gold on her left hand, a delicate wedding band that screamed a truth I had desperately, foolishly refused to see. It wasn't just a ring, it was a brand, a declaration of ownership that excluded me entirely. I traced the condensation on the glass, the cool dampness a stark contrast to the burning in my chest. Mistress. The word echoed in the cavernous silence of the apartment, a label that had never felt quite right, yet now seemed a cruel, suffocating certainty. I had convinced myself otherwise, hadn't I? I'd believed in the stolen moments, the intoxicating intensity of his gaze, the whispered promises that felt so real in the privacy of this gilded cage. But the photograph was a cold, hard slap of reality. He wasn't just secretive, he was married, and I was the clandestine affair, the convenient distraction, the woman kept in the shadows while his real life played out elsewhere. The gnawing unease of the past few weeks, the furtive glances from Ms. Albright, the almost pitying looks from the household staff, they all coalesced into a single horrifying realization. They knew. They had always known. They'd seen me for what I was, while I, blinded by Julian's charm and the intoxicating allure of his world, had been the last to understand. My fingers tightened on the cool glass. Rage, hot and sharp, began to cut through the fog of despair. He had played me. He had used me. And the worst part, the truly soul-crushing part, was how easily I had let him. I, Clara Hayes, a freelance graphic designer who prided herself on her sharp eye and discerning taste, had willingly stepped into the role of the kept woman, the secret lover, the one whose existence was never to be acknowledged in the harsh light of day. But I wouldn't let it end like this. Not with me silently weeping in this luxurious prison. Not with Julian continuing his charade, oblivious to the wreckage he'd left behind. The photograph had been a catalyst, but Ms. Albright, Ms. Albright was the key. Her severe composure, the way she always seemed to be observing, cataloging, understanding more than she revealed, it had always unnerved me. She was Julian's right hand, his gatekeeper, the one person who likely knew the intricate details of his carefully constructed life. And she had agreed to meet me. A jolt of nervous energy shot through me. The cafe was not far, a discreet place on the edge of the financial district. Far from Julian's usual haunts. It was a neutral territory, a place where I could demand answers without the suffocating weight of his presence. I pulled on a simple black dress, the fabric feeling too light, too inadequate against the storm raging inside me. I didn't bother with makeup. The raw emotion etched on my face was all the declaration I needed. As I stepped out of the building and into the cool, damp night air, the city seemed to hold its breath. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, slicking the already polished streets. Each step I took felt deliberate, heavy with the weight of intent. I hailed a cab, the driver's indifferent gaze a welcome respite from the imagined scrutiny of Julian's world. The drive was a blur of flashing lights and slick asphalt. My mind replayed conversations, Julian's carefully worded evasions, the times he'd steered conversations away from his personal life with practiced ease. I'd dismissed it as discretion, a desire for privacy born of his public profile. Now it felt like calculated deception. The cafe was warm, dimly lit, and blessedly anonymous. The aroma of roasted coffee beans and buttery pastries hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the penthouse. I spotted Ms. Albright immediately, seated at a small table in the corner, a single cup of tea in front of her. She looked as immaculate and unyielding as ever, her dark suit a sharp silhouette against the muted tones of the cafe. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it, the moment of reckoning. I walked towards her, each step deliberate, my gaze locked on her impassive face. She looked up as I approached, her expression unreadable. There was no warmth, no sympathy, only a quiet acknowledgement of my arrival. "Ms. Hayes," she said, her voice a low, precise alto, devoid of any inflection. She gestured to the empty chair opposite her. I sat down, the worn velvet of the seat a welcome change from the sleek, cold leather of Julian's furniture. I didn't offer pleasantries. There was no time for them, no desire for them. "You agreed to meet me," I stated, my voice a little rougher than I intended. "I did," she confirmed, her eyes sharp and intelligent, meeting mine. There was something in them, a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher. Curiosity? Resignation? "I need you to tell me the truth," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "About Julian. About me." Ms. Albright took a slow sip of her tea, her movements economical and precise. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. It was a silence I knew well, the kind Julian cultivated. But from Ms. Albright, it felt different. Less like a tactic, more like a prelude. "The truth, Miss Hayes," she began, her gaze steady, "is rarely as simple as we wish it to be." "But it is the truth," I insisted, my voice rising slightly. "I saw a photograph. Julian, he's married, isn't he?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Ms. Albright's expression remained impassive, but a subtle shift occurred, a tightening around her eyes. "Mr. Thorne's personal life is complex," she replied, choosing her words with extreme care. "Complex?" I scoffed, the sound brittle. "I'm his mistress, aren't I? That's what the photograph suggests." A faint, almost imperceptible sigh escaped her lips. "Mistress is a term that implies a certain understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of the arrangement." My breath hitched. "And that's not what this is?" She finally broke eye contact, her gaze drifting to the rain-streaked window. Mr. Thorne is a man of considerable influence, Miss Hayes. He has a reputation to maintain. Certain arrangements are made to protect that reputation. Arrangements, I repeated, the word tasting like ash. So, I am an arrangement, a carefully managed secret. You were provided for, Ms. Albright said, her tone carefully neutral. You were given a lifestyle beyond what your current profession might afford. The casual dismissal of my emotional entanglement stung more than any insult. So I was bought, I stated, the realization a bitter pill, and I let myself be bought. You were persuaded, she corrected, her voice still measured. Mr. Thorne has a unique way of making people feel valued, essential. Essential to what? I demanded, my voice cracking. To his deception? To his lies? She finally looked back at me, and in her eyes, for the first time, I saw a flicker of something akin to pity. Ms. Hayes, you believe you were his mistress. You believe you were the woman he turned to in secret. And I'm wrong? The question was a desperate plea. She reached a hand, not to touch me, but to push a small, immaculately folded envelope across the table. It was plain white, with no markings. This document, she said, her voice dropping lower, is a marriage certificate, dated 3 years ago. My hands trembled as I reached for it. The paper felt impossibly thin, fragile, yet it held the weight of my entire world. I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the official seals, the printed names. Julian Thorne, Clara Hayes, the date, my name, legally bound to his. The world tilted. The hum of the cafe faded into a distant drone. My breath caught in my throat, a strangled gasp. This wasn't just a marriage certificate. This was proof. Proof that I wasn't his mistress. Proof that I had been his wife all along. The opulent cage, the stolen moments, the clandestine affair. It was all a carefully constructed illusion, a performance designed to keep me ignorant, compliant, and utterly under his control. The rage that had been simmering beneath the surface now ignited, a wildfire consuming all other emotions. Betrayal, yes, but this was deeper, more insidious. This was a violation of my very identity, a theft of my autonomy. He hadn't just lied, he had erased my agency, making me a pawn in a game I hadn't even known I was playing. But how? I whispered, my voice barely audible. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile this document with the narrative I had been living. When? I don't remember. Ms. Albright's gaze was steady, her expression one of grim understanding. You were indisposed, Miss Hayes. Mr. Thorne handled the matter. It was, as he put it, for your own protection, and his. Indisposed. The word was a cold, clinical euphemism. What had happened? What had he done? The gaps in my memory, the hazy periods he'd always brushed aside with vague explanations, now took on a terrifying significance. He hadn't just married me, he had practically abducted me into marriage. He forged it, I stammered, the idea